Hello everyone, Voidmaster here. Welcome to another episode of the What If Every Nation Went to War series. This is 100 years later, and yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So, again, starting off with the Americas, as you can see, very little has changed. North America has stayed basically the same for the last, 50 years? So, not much here. Although America has further solidified its control over this region. This region is mostly just, used for supplies and used for resources. But overall, not much happened. Even, I didn't say anything about revolts, but even if there were revolts, if this had existed for this long, they'd probably be gone by now. But, revolts aren't counted in this series. Well, not really majorly anyways. So, not important. Anyways, moving on to Europe. As we can see, this continent now really has a clear winner, as pretty much it is just America. As you can see, Turkey is still holding out in Istanbul and in Athens. China is still kind of there in the Caucasus. But, the Americans have now completely kicked Turkey out of, anything apart from the very edges of Europe, and have started making pushes against China into what used to be Russia. But their advances are painfully slow. And, moving south, we have the Middle East, which, Turkey is still kind of the ruler of the Middle East, but, they are dealing with major problems. They're losing land to India, they're losing land to China, and they're losing land to the U.S. The only front they're winning is the Egyptian front, or now the African front, really. And, Turkey is overall not in a great spot and might not last too much longer because their homeland is currently, very, very much threatened by America, and, China's coming on their, some of their other good regions. So their only real, safe regions are Arabia and Egypt, which are the farthest away from the original Turkic homeland, and probably the least, Arabia at least is probably the least valuable because, at this point, we've been going for 100 years, any oil that was being taken out of here has either dried up or the infrastructure's probably been destroyed. So the oil here probably isn't that useful, because remember, we're in 2122. Not 22, 25, sorry. But, so any resources that existed here have probably been mostly spent. And that's actually probably a thing that I haven't talked about in a lot of these regions, is that most of the resources have been spent. And most of anything that we would think of warfare or of what you need, it's completely changed. So, obviously this is an entirely fictional scenario. And at this point in the scenario, you don't even need to take it with any amount of salt. Just it's fiction at this point. We can just call it fiction. We're so far away. This is barely alternate history, and at this point, it might as well be called grounded fantasy. But yeah. Anyways, moving on to South Asia. As you can see, India is continuing to very slowly but surely lose ground to both America and China, but they're still doing well, holding out in South Asia. Neither China nor India. Neither China nor India can really break through the Himalayas, and America, while they're making some progress, are still very slow into the, Indonesian front. So overall, India's not doing amazing, but they're certainly doing better than some of the other nations, and are certainly not going to collapse anytime soon. Moving up to China, which at this point can just beat all of Asia minus the South. They are by far the biggest non-US combatant, and as you can see, they're really the only ones with a real fighting chance against the US. They have been losing a bit of land. They lost the Philippines. Actually, I don't know if they lost the Philippines or if India lost no, I think China. Yeah, China lost. If you can't tell, I've not done one of these for a while, but anyways, yeah, China lost the Philippines to America. They're getting pushed a little bit in Siberia, and they're getting pushed a little bit in the Caucasus. But overall, they're fighting the US off very well, and they're also making progress against Turkey. So, China is really the only power in this scenario left that is really strong enough to stand up to the Americans. So, yeah. Moving over to Oceania, it is very much the same story as the Americas or Europe. There is minor fighting in Indonesia, but apart from that, this is all America. It is just America. I think America is right now the only nation that, controls one continent, and it's not one. They all basically control 4. So this isn't going too well. The only ones that are left are the 2 largest continents. So, yeah, either way, not much to talk about in, Oceania. we see these little outposts being made in the outback, which are the only bit of this that have been really taken instead of just occupied. And, but, most of it is just, U.S. occupation. And there's barely even need to talk about this region apart from the Indian front, which America is making slow progress in. So, yeah. Moving over to the final continent, which is Africa. As you can see, the main loser here for, this entire 10-year gap, or 10-year skip, is Egypt. They have pretty much lost the entire northern coast and, lost a lot of their population base. And even South Africa is making pushes against them. And, we see that Egypt is very close to collapse, if you cannot tell. Like, they're held off in Lagos and to a lesser extent Ethiopia. But, they've lost their capital and they've lost pretty much all their homeland. So morale in, Egypt is very low. That stuff isn't really much of an issue here. But, at this point, Egypt's economy is also, collapsed entirely. Like, they have no money left to fight. They have basically no resources left to fight. Africa has lots of resources, but the problem is getting them all out. And, they're running out of people who are willing to fight. Because right now, everyone who's in their army is people who aren't actually Egyptian. They've only been under Egypt for 60, 50, 45 years. So, they might not be too happy dying for Egypt, and they're very much losing war. And finally, we have South Africa, still controlling the south, and, still doing fine. They control Tanzania over through the Congo, and, overall they're doing well against Egypt. They're the only power that I think isn't actively fighting the U.S. at this point. Yeah, they're the only power that is not currently being attacked by the Americans, which is kind of crazy that out of every state, America is attacking, like, out of the non-American nations, the U.S. is attacking 4 of the 5 of the remaining ones, and, are pretty close to the 6. All they have to do is, like, launch a naval attack, and then they'd be going 6 for 6. But, yeah, as you can see, America has a very good shot of winning this. Right now, I'm going to be honest, it's really just between America and China. There might be some, surprises still in stock, but, right now, those two are looking to be the most powerful. So, yeah. One more thing. After this, this series is getting ridiculously long. So, after this, we're actually going to be going up by 25 years every time instead of 10. I think it's about time because the fronts are moving really, really slowly, and I think it's about time we start getting to the end of this series because it has been going on for quite literally 7 months. I think I started this in December last year. So it has been 7 months since this series started. And I think it's finally time to give it some sort of conclusion. So, yeah. Stay tuned for that. So, yeah, I will see you guys later. Hope you have a good day and a great year. And that's Voidmaster signing out. See ya!